So hello friends, we're still talking about Baudrillard. We tried to read it together, so this is assisted reading. It's just educational, purely educational, so let's just dive in. We already talked about the simulacra, right? We said that it is a copy that has no contact with reality anymore, and somehow we observe here that the process of signification is fundamentally interrupted. And in regards to this copying mechanism that we also see, for example, in the metaverse of Mark Zuckerberg, we will now see a process of reference. So he will take different cultural examples to explain this better to us. Let me explain very briefly again what the simulacrum could be in our society. It could be the metaverse, because the metaverse is a copy of a real world that ultimately is not supposed to refer to what is real anymore. It is just supposed to refer to itself. And I think this is what Baudrillard now wants to discuss as the so-called divine irreference of images. So as far as I understand, it is the idea that images don't relate to reality anymore, that that images are in a certain sense bereft of a certain function, and that it is a self-referential process. But this is more an assumption, so let's read it a little bit more in detail. So what does he do? What does he do first? He wants to say, okay, we have dissimulation. That's to pretend that you have not something. So I try to pretend that I don't earn money because I'm super rich, but I just wear these cheap t-shirts. So I give like the simulation of not having something, and actually it's a dissimulation. However, he now wants to say that simulation is something else than just pretending. So for example, when somebody fakes an illness, that is what he says here, he can simply stay in bed, as he writes, and so he pretends to be sick, but the symptoms are still referencing the real disease. So it has not yet lost the relationship to reality. So he says here, pretending or dissimulating leaves the principle of reality intact. So there is still a relationship between my simulated symptoms and what is supposed to be the reality. Nevertheless, he then says that simulation threatens the difference between the true and the false, the real and the imaginary. So when we talk about simulations, it's really difficult to say whether something is true or not. So for example, when I talk in the metaverse and I see a house, I wouldn't say, well, this is a true image of a house. Well, obviously it's not the image of any house, also not of our fantasy, of our imagination or something. It's just a house within the metaverse. What you see is what you get, right? And so there's no relationship to reality anymore. Same when we, for example, have the paper bin on our desktop. It does not really represent a paper bin anymore, but it represents a function within the system. Well, somehow there is still a relationship to reality, but at a certain point it doesn't matter anymore if that relationship is actually abolished. And now we have another interesting phenomenon which he references to as psychosomatics. And psychosomatics is the idea that symptoms are produced, but at the same time they represent a real disease. They are not just pretending to be sick anymore. Now suddenly we are sick. So we have back pain. There's no organic reason for it. We just have back pain. And he says this transfers the symptom of the organic order to the unconscious order. So it's not related to our body, the organic side of us anymore, but it is now somehow related to our personality, soul, or whatever the unconscious order is. And this is a very interesting sentence in this regard. The latter is new and taken for real, more real than the other. So suddenly the psychological order becomes more important, right? And the question is, well, he writes here, But why would simulation be at the gates of the unconsciousness? Why couldn't the work of the unconscious be produced in the same way as an old symptom of classical medicine, right? So he says, like, in the psychomatic sphere, like in the sphere of our psychology, there are now different mechanisms working. It's not like the same that we have a real organ that represents a cause for real symptoms. Some of the psychomatic or the psychological dimension works differently. And he says, well, dreams in a certain sense are real. There are real expressions of something that is, but that has no reference to an outside reality. I think that is what he wants to say here. I mean, I have a little bit of a problem to understand what he means here by dreams. So if you could explain that to me, I would be thankful. I would be thankful. He says dreams already are. Let's just mark it 3 times. So, okay, let's go on. Okay, so he goes on here to say that the psychiatrist believes that we can safeguard, as he says, the principle of truth. And how do we safeguard that? Well, we say that for every form of mental alienation, there is a particular order in the succession of symptoms of which the simulator is ignorant and in the absence of which the psychiatrists would not be deceived. So if a person simulates something, he doesn't really know how to simulate it in a real way. And so we still can maintain the idea that we have truth, reference, and objective causes. But the question is, of course, or it remains, whether there are discourses in which the difference of the duplication of illness, or where the duplication of illness, the representation of symptoms, I have to say it again. So the question remains whether there are discourses where the difference between simulating a symptom and really having the symptom disappears. He says, what can psychoanalysis do with the duplication of the discourse of the unconscious in the discourse of simulation that can never again be unmasked, since it's not false either? So what does he say here? I believe he says something like, can we have a psychological discourse where the simulation is itself the disease? And he then talks about the army. So we have similar of such phenomena in the army. And in the army, of course, people try to simulate that they are sick in order to avoid going to the war or something, right? Today, the army can discharge a very good simulator as exactly equivalent to a real homosexual, a heart patient, or a madman, right? Because they say if he simulates it well enough, then there's no difference between the symptom and the real disease anymore. There's no difference between the simulation and the real disease. If he is this good at acting crazy, it's because he is. So if you go to the army and you act like crazy, they will accept that. In this sense, all crazy people simulate, and this lack of distinction is the worst kind of subversion. It is against the lack of distinction, and it submerges the principle of truth. So simulating that you are crazy is actually crazy. That's the funny thing here. So he goes on, he now transfers the discourse to the question of God. And there we have the idea of the so-called iconoclasts. These were actually people who forbade to use any kind of images of God. So here's the quote: I forbade that there be any simulacra in the temples because the divinity that animates nature can never be represented. So why do they want to forbid simulating God, giving pictures of God? That's here the big question. And he has an interesting thesis on that. He says they fear that deep down God never existed and that only the simulacrum ever existed, even that God himself was never anything but its own simulacrum. And so they feel the urge to destroy the images. So because they believe in images of God, they fear that God himself is just, for example, an image, a simulation of the mind and not real. So he says for that reason, they want to destroy the images. One can live with the idea of distorted truth, but their metaphysical despair came from the idea that the image didn't conceal anything at all, and that these images were in essence not images such as an original model would have made them, but perfect simulacra, for radiant with their own fascination. They were exorcised at all costs. So they believe that a good simulation of God is as good as God could simulate himself. Therefore they forbid it, because then the difference between God and the simulation of God would disappear, because God would be a simulation or only occur in the form of a simulation. That's a very interesting interpretation. Okay, so what happens next, right? He says that the iconolators, right, the iconolators or iconolators, they were actually interested in representing God. And he says they were modern minds, the most adventurous, because they knew that God became apparent in the mirror of images. So God becomes alive in whatever images are. And so what they do is they actually tell or foretell the story of God's death, because technically God dies in the pictures. He's reduced to these pictures, and he says that the Jesuits made that their guiding principle, and that is the end of transcendence, which now only serves as an alibi for a strategy altogether to free influences and signs. Behind the baroqueness of images hides the eminent grace of politics. So what does he want to say? Well, in the idea of packing God into images, we can eliminate the difference between the signs and God. And I don't know, for whatever reason we have actually a better politics, because, for example, here he calls it the murderous power of images, right? Which is murderous of the real and so on. However, it destroys the mediation between the visible and the real. The sign becomes the real. We will worship to real. That a sign could refer to the death of meaning, that a sign could be exchanged for meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange. God, of course. This is the state in which we are now. We replace the transcendent God with something that is really there. And this also speaks to the danger that he expresses in the question: what if God himself can be simulated, that is to say, can be reduced to the signs that constitute faith? Then the whole system becomes weightless, a gigantic simulacrum, never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. So he takes here the idea of God that is reduced to pictures, where the real is the picture, to be the idea of the modern simulacrum. So according to this idea, images produce themselves by referencing just to other images, meme culture and so on and so forth. A relationship to the real is lost. Such is simulation insofar as it is opposed to representation. Representation stems from the principle of the equivalence of the sign and the real. Simulation, on the contrary, stems from the utopia of the principle of equivalence, from the sign as the reversion and death sentence of every reference, whereas representation attempts to absorb simulation by interpreting it as false representation. Simulation envelopes the whole edifice of representation itself as a simulacrum. So in other words, we kill reference, we just dive completely into simulation. We are not pretending anymore. The simulation becomes what is the real. The matrix is what it is in itself. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope this helped you reading this rather dense, complicated book. I must admit, Baudrillard seems to be incredibly interesting, similar to Sloterdijk, I would say. So I hope you enjoyed that and you will follow such readings of difficult texts in the future too. I think that may be better than a Wikipedia page to really look into the text and reading it with a critical mindset. So if you have any criticisms of my interpretation where I said something wrong or where I didn't understand something completely, then please let me know. I'm not interested in comments like, this is all bullshit, like I don't like that, right? I like to see the concrete criticism with regard to the text where we can improve interpretations or where there may be left questions where something unclear. Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, if you like it, then please follow and let's work together on more difficult texts in the future. Live long and prosper. Bye-bye.